Hello all, this is our second lecture in week 8, prisons at the end of the 20th century. So what's the state of prisons at the end of the 20th century? How do they compare to the 6x6 jails of the 18th century? This is summarily taken mostly from Scott Christensen's With Liberty for Some, 500 Years of Imprisonment in America. I'm sure some of you who did prison reform used his book too. So California in the 1980s had the largest prison system in the country. In 1978, new determinate sentencing laws, $6.2 billion expansion. By 1991, largest prison population in the country. By 1977 to 1991, $826 million to $2.3 billion. 1977 to 1991, 19,623 prisoners to 97,000 inmates. It's a continued growth. In 1996, there's 135,249 inmates. The state committed an additional $5.22 billion. The demographics were not hardened predators. They're often young, non-violent, drug-addicted, semi-illiterate, unemployed, minorities, male. And in 1989, 30% of black men between 20 and 29 were in jail, probation, or on parole. In 1994, 40% of CA California black men in their 20s were under correctional supervision, 11% of Hispanics, and 5% of white men. Texas and Florida were not far behind. California was 16th in the U.S. rate of imprisonment per 100,000 of the population, and federal populations grew from 24,000 in 1980 to 95,000 in 1994, nearly a 300% increase. And that's just a shocking number. In 1990 to 1995, there's a nation-built 168 state prisons and 45 federal prisons. It increased the number of institutions to 1,500. Blacks continued to be incarcerated at a higher rate, mid-1985, 8 times that of white men. Drugs. Most inmates were in for drugs or drug crimes or addicted to drugs. Federal inmates, 1985, 38% were sentenced for drug offenses. In 1994, 62% of inmates were sentenced for drug offenses. Women were even more likely to serve because of drugs. 66% of women and 57% of men were incarcerated for drug offenses. Crimes/imprisonment. Crimes declined in the U.S. In 1993, 5.2% of Americans experienced personal crime, and 31% experienced crime against property. In 2003, 2.3% experienced personal crime, and 16.1% experienced property crime. And you can see that property crime is almost halved. Prison rates at the same time increased. In 1990, 4.3 million adults under correctional supervision. In 2006, 7.2 million adults under correctional supervision. And race continues to be a factor as 2% of all whites and 9% of all African Americans. The prison's business during this period is for profit. It's no longer a matter of social welfare. Prison construction is booming. It switched from not in my backyard to welcoming an infusion of money for jobs and commercial benefit. Competition for placement, especially in rural areas that were economically deprived. Could be a town's largest employer. Job security, no danger of an industrial plant that would move away. did little to help the inmates transition to the community when they were released. Families of the inmates were not welcomed. Prison guards were allowed to unionize. It was a boon for architects, builders, electricians, and plumbers. Return to profit from prisoners' labor, the get tougher attitude, need to reduce skyrocketing costs of imprisonment, appeal of prisons as a source of cheap labor, the privatization of prisons, which operated to make profits. Their prisoners were paid less than a minimum wage. California Folsom made steel tanks for microbreweries. Hawaii packed Spalding golf balls. Illinois sorted inventory for Toys R Us. Nevada converted luxury automobiles into stretch limousines. Oregon manufactured uniforms for McDonald's. And Tennessee made Eddie Bauer jeans. The prisons become operated on war model rather than a medical model. Enemies versus patients, which I realize may not seem problematic to everyone. I understand that they've committed crimes, but we're talking about a lot of people being in there for drug issues and drug addictions, and it does not treat the addiction or deal with any of the issues that might have brought them to prison. There's domestic defense, and it's compared to welfare. 1991, $20.1 billion on the building and operating of prisons for 1.1 million inmates, $22.9 billion on AFDC for 13.5 million women and children. So if you can just take a minute and look at the issue of the spending between the two. We are spending on the building and operating of prisons for 1.1 million inmates, $20.1 billion. That is only slightly less than is being spent at the same time on 13.5 million women and children who are not incarcerated. 1996, cuts in welfare but increased costs of prisons. Politicians portray welfare as a frill or a luxury, but they support the massive building of prisons. Yet some criticism can be levied against each. They do the opposite of what they're intended to do. Prisons tend to be a revolving door. It's associated with urban poor and often linked to minorities. Many states were spending more on prisons than education. In California, 1980, 2% of the budget on prisons and 12.6% on education. In California, in 1995, 9.9% of the budget was spent on prisons and 9.9% on higher education. Rather than spend money on better housing, medical care, education, and welfare for people who needed it, states spent more money on prisons and incarceration. As the least successful institutions, and yet they continued to endure despite that. It started out on talking about indoor relief, including penitentiaries, focused on reform. Historians, sociologists, economists, political scientists, and philosophers have studied and analyzed the persistent evolution of prisons. Prisons no longer transform, reform, or rehabilitate people. Prisons remove people from the streets, get them out of circulation, which is the most common American response to behavior outside of the mainstream. But they don't actually change any of that behavior. And we can see that in the issues of recidivism. I mean, once they go to prison, they're likely to come back. This is my last lecture on prisons. There is more data you can access, so I hope some of you have researched the conditions in light of the history of prisons and penitentiaries in the U.S. And I hope all of you have an increased awareness in the way we build prisons and treat inmates, and what kind of reflections that might make on our society today. The next lecture will be about the recent developments in social welfare and is the last lecture in our class. And this is our reference slide for today. I hope that you all are having a great day and a great week, and thanks for watching.